This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. Hi. What do you guys want to talk about? Thanks, guys. Back to you.
We having fun yet? I sure am. I don't even know what day it is. I'm so out of sorts. I believe it is Thursday at the time I'm recording this. And then at some point this will go up on Friday. Morning, afternoon, evening. I don't even know anymore. But I try to make it work. One day at a time. So, what do you guys want to talk about? No, I'm just kidding. We're not doing that. How many years did it take Cody to actually get that stupid phrase over? And he did. That's the best part. Well, I know we're here to talk about classic wrestling footage. At some point during the weekend, I'm going to have to figure out when I'm going to watch Retro Raw and Retro NXT. I don't know when that'll be. I'm going away this weekend. But I should have time. Regardless, we'll go ahead and get going with Friday's show here. It's the Five Starr Wrestling Report. The wrestling podcast that nobody knows but everybody needs. And especially during these dark times when modern wrestling is such a tragedy. Well, it's nice to talk about wrestling history since apparently nobody else cares to do that anymore. Outside the old timers. I think it's, isn't it Ted DiBiase who taglined "Everybody's Got a Podcast"? It's true. Christ, even Taker has a podcast now. That is when you know kayfabe is dead. The day The Undertaker decided to permanently break character and become Mark Calloway, that marks the official end date of wrestling history as we know it. I'm obviously kidding. I hope people don't take that seriously. In any case, we'll go ahead and get diving into the podcast here. As usual, Crockett TV opening up Seg 1 of the show. And we are back to the 1 hour formula this week. It is a holiday week. And we've also reached the month of September here in 1988, which is one of the more significant months in the year. It's the month we officially lose Tully and Arn to the WWF, thus completely eradicating all that momentum they started with the Horseman Midnight's feud over the late summer. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Jim Crockett is still negotiating terms with the network and looking for an outing with the TBS execs, because he's losing money hand over fist. It is a rough patch here in the fall of '88. And it really is kind of the beginning of the end of the glory era for Crockett TV. We are certainly entering a real turning point here with the retro reviews in WCW. It's hard to imagine, but we've been covering the golden years of '86 and '87. Even a couple great moments here in '88. It's all about to change as we transition into '89. And the new regime takes over. Real quick, though, before we get going with the studio coverage, It is our 85th consecutive cold open featuring Brad Armstrong and Al Perez. And ironically enough, I think this is brand new archive footage. Now, we've been talking about the series of syndicated show angles over like 3 weeks now. The one where Perez was choking Armstrong with a chain. And they kept splicing up the footage over a series of like 2 or 3 weeks. Well, this time, we open with presumably Sunday syndicated footage of Brad and Dusty versus Al and Kevin Sullivan. They had alluded to the idea that Brad wanted to get his hands on both Sullivan and Perez, but that he was open to teaming with Dusty since he also has issues with those two. So in our quick highlight reel, we see Brad getting worked over, and right as he went to tag in Dusty to start the comeback, they immediately go to the opening credits to start the program. And, well, we never found out what happened past the Dusty bionic elbows. I presume the babyfaces somehow went over. And or it was a DQ. And getting past the opening dialogue with the announcers here, plugging all the special interviews and the superstars for the week. The opener is the Fantastics versus Keith Steinborn and George South. I think I've made the joke before. If so, I apologize. I swear to God, George South's hair grows like 10 more feet every time I see him. And it's not like the long hair suits his look. He has a mullet that appears to only grow outwards. It's called pomade, friend. I'm sure they already invented it by 1988. Use it. Overall, the match is very uneventful. Fantastics went over with a rocket launcher on Keith. But fuck all that nonsense. Nobody cares about any of that. Let's talk about the real meat and potatoes of this week's show. The greatest Dusty Rhodes promo of all time. You can take your hard times promos and shove them where the sun don't shine, brother. I don't care. This was the single most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. So Dusty comes out to do this promo with David. And you can already tell he's really irritated. Or that he at least has something on his mind beyond the story material he's about to go over. He starts by talking about Gary Hart and the dog collar, telling him that he's so obsessed with choking out Dusty with the chain. Well, they ought to do it here right now and get it over with. Meanwhile, during the tirade on Gary and Kevin Sullivan, he's also trying to put over the nice people in attendance. But there's one specific crowd member that's been bothering him for weeks now. A recurring studio heckler. And Dusty's had it. He's here to call out this fat lady up against the back wall. So Dusty brings down the studio crowd. Gets him real quiet. He wants everybody around the world to hear what he's about to unleash on this fat broad. He goes, "For weeks now, this fat lady's been calling out Dusty Rhodes, calling him a whale." And you see Dusty kind of smile and turn toward David. He's trying so hard to keep his composure because you know he's about to unload on this fucking bimbo. He's got a line that'll put her to shame. So he turns back and goes, "Honey, I've turned down fat broads uglier than you before. Don't you try and interrupt my train of thought." Like, what do you even say? I just want to stand up and give the man a rousing ovation. Red Pill Dusty Rhodes here at the TBS studios in 1988. putting fat ladies in their place and humbling them. And like, here's the greatest part of all of it. At no point do they actually show this lady on camera. This was all just Dusty going into business for himself. He said, I'm not about to let this asshole ruin another one of my TV segments. It was a total inside rib by Dusty to make sure we, the audience, know this obnoxious woman is causing problems. And I want everybody around the world to make sure that we know she's fat. And not only that, but that we also know that Dusty has turned down uglier and fatter women than her before. The level of sass is almost too much to handle. So, of course, well, that all happened in the first 10 minutes of the program. I don't think anything else came remotely close to topping it in terms of sheer entertainment. I mean, even Stink's promo on Barry Windham couldn't top what Dusty said. Although he set a very bad precedent for all the other babyfaces. Because now everybody was obligated to call out the fat lady in the back of the studio. Here's actually the extent of what I wrote down here. Sting talked about his sneakers. Called out Barry. Said they'll be touring around the country together. Called out the fat lady once more. And then he quoted Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then Jim Cornette came out to introduce the Midnights for their match with Gary Royal and Mike Jackson. And again, just to reiterate what we said last week during that fire promo they all did on the Horsemen, Bobby, Stan, JC, all full-fledged babyfaces. Crowd gave them a standing applause when they came out for this match. I guess it would be more apropos to say they're baby faces that still work like heels through cheating and double team tactics. I mean, in 1986, this would have gotten them booed out of the building if they had tried the same thing with the Rock and Roll Express. But because they're in there working with Gary Royal and Mike Jackson, people all went nuts for it. I mean, there's no attempt at even trying to work a normal tag match here. Stan and Bobby are out there choking these guys with camera cords, beating them up on the floor, running them into the podium. Like, JC is still delivering heel lines, but all of his pot shots are directed solely at the Horsemen. I did like his quote. I know I can't whip Tully or Arn in a fight, but I can go through J.J. Dillon like X-Lax through a widowed woman. Where in the fuck did he think of these catchphrases? I don't even think I've ever heard him use that on his podcast before. X-Lax through a widowed woman. Damn, corny. That must be a Southern thing. So what ends up happening, after the Midnight spend 99.9% of the match beating up on these two guys, Corny just hits the ring with his tennis racket for the Blaine disqualification. Just creams Gary Royal over the back with it. And the only thing the announcers could say was, well, these guys clearly don't care. And again, crowd is cheering for him like they're God's gift to the universe. And then they do a promo. I should say Corny did a promo. Just kind of putting the finishing touches on everything we saw. Talks about the history of the Midnights and Crockett Promotions and all the devious things they're responsible for. Putting Bobby Fulton in a hospital bed. Burning Ronnie Garvin's face. Cracking Ricky Morton's windpipe with a tennis racket and then blooding up Robert Gibson. These are all things the Horsemen claim they're capable of doing. Only the Midnights have actually accomplished those things. And whether the people cheer them or boo them, fact is, the people don't know what they want. but the Midnights have made it absolutely clear what they want. It is the World Tag Team Championships. Then he brings up Arn's promo from last week about the dogs and fire hydrants and something about Mercedes cars. A promo, by the way, that I completely wiped from memory because I had no idea what the hell Arn was talking about. All I know is Cornette retorted back on that promo by saying, the Midnights could easily do to the Horsemen what dogs can do to fire hydrants. The only caveat being it would be the first time they actually looked and smelled like men. So like I said, the Midnights are clearly babyfaces, despite how corny wants the people to perceive them. He is desperately trying to maintain the illusion they're still bad guys, but I don't think it's working, brother. We've reached NWO levels of fan support where the Midnights are just too cool to hate. They're too badass. Nobody wants to boo them. And unlike the NWO, the Midnights are actually cool and badass. Not a bunch of grown men cosplaying as edgy bully teenagers. So then we came back for what was supposed to be a TV title match between Mike Rotunda and gorgeous Jimmy Garvin. But this did not go according to plan. Due to an altercation between Precious and Kevin Sullivan before the bell, we see Sullivan try to grab Precious by the wrist. Obviously, she was coming out with Jimmy. And then when Jimmy went to throw a punch at Sullivan, that led to a huge brawl taking place over by the interview podium. Ending with Sullivan shoving Precious to the floor and then smashing a giant cinder block over Garvin's leg. It was either a cinder block or some type of heavy brick. I still don't really know. But as the heels scurry off, the other baby faces empty out from the back to try to help Garvin on the gurney. I can't really refer to this as a great heat angle, mainly due to, a conglomeration of things. Number one, Precious's horrible acting. Number two, Jimmy Garvin screaming, my knee, in very cartoon-like fashion. And number three, probably the gravest offense, the fact that the babyfaces just picked the guy up and threw him on the gurney like he was a sack of potatoes. If this were real, I'm fairly sure protocol would have been much different. Like, just the fact that no medical professionals came out to help. Like the boys just somehow magically figured, well, let's get the guy on the cart ourselves and then transport him over to the ambulance. Clearly, we're trained to deal with these kinds of situations. This all happened very fast. That's my main point. Now, I presume this is going to be their way to write Garvin off the program for the foreseeable future. I know he comes back later on in '89 as a member of the newly formed Freebirds, but I believe this is their way to phase him out for the time being. He had already been fairly inactive since the fallout of the Bash Tour stuff with the Varsity Club. Credit to them, at least they bothered to give it some kind of story explanation instead of just letting the guy vanish and then not bringing it up. Again, not a poorly done angle. I just think it could have been fleshed out a little bit more. And so we come back from break where Rotunda's in the ring calling out Garvin from the back. And while JR's trying to interview him and ask him who his real opponent's going to be, we hear Sullivan scream, "I'll get you a real opponent." Fast forward 30 seconds. Out comes Bob Emery, which the announcers immediately scoffed at. I had actually thought it was Kurt Thompson for a hot second there. But then Shivani said, Bob Emery. And I was like, sure, okay. We'll go with that. They're all interchangeable anyway. So Rotunda made quick work of him. I mean, it was all mainly background noise while they filmed Sullivan having a conniption on the floor, which was kind of funny. But the big thing afterwards was Dr. Death hitting the ring and then sending the Varsity Club to the back. That got a mildly decent pop. And it was a good way to advance the next chapter in the Varsity Club storyline. Obviously, Dr. Death becomes a crucial factor into the stories we progress, and all the stuff that happens in the lead up to Starrcade, which we'll eventually cover. Right now, he's merely an adversary, but that will definitely change. So as we come back, and the announcers are going over the footage we just saw, David Crockett is obviously shaken up by it. I love that how in his attempts at explaining the Jimmy situation, he has to explicitly point out that his leg is not only broken, it is also twisted and bent. Like he's a fucking bendable stick character. So anyway, he rushes off to the local medical facility. And they also re-aired the whole thing in slow motion, which, looking back, I'm not entirely sure why slow motion was necessary for the whole beating. Kind of wasted like 3 minutes of airtime. But they show Sullivan driving the brick down on Garvin's ankle. Tony selling it by going, oh, and oh. Yes, clearly you could tell Tony was very sympathetic to the situation. He also made sure to let us know these kinds of situations, they really should be settled in the ring. You don't say, Tony. It almost kind of sounds like this shit is a work. And then from there, we had a Ric Flair pre-tape where he was calling out Lex Luger from a locker room somewhere. It was a very cut and dry, kiss-stealing, wheel-and-dealing Ric Flair promo. He did at one point mention the fact that Flair is so wealthy and so successful, it may be a tough nut to swallow. Yeah. We'll just go ahead and leave that one alone. And then he talked about how he's better than all the local celebrities because he's the champ. He's better than Dale Green, Herschel Walker. It was funny. When he mentioned Herschel, right as he was trying to talk about him being a successful black celebrity, the minute he tried to say the word black, his voice cracked and shot up like 10 notches. That was pretty much all there was to it. The storyline of Flair and Luger throughout all of '88 is, let's see how long we can possibly drag out the same verbiage over and over again without ever actually settling on a date or time for the rematch. I'm not kidding you. Every Flair-Luger promo since Baltimore, it's the exact same dialogue. Someday, this rematch will happen. Someday, we'll get in the ring and square off again. Apparently by someday, they meant sometime in the next 18 to 24 months. In actuality, it was more like 2. But you see what I'm getting at. So then we had Barry Windham versus the Italian Stallion. Pretty short. Fairly boring. Barry did 1,000 moves in a row and then one with a lariat. Then we came back for a J.J. Berry promo. And the interviewer here, this blew my mind. David Crockett. What the fuck? Did he just magically teleport from the hospital? Where the hell did David come from? Did he not just say in the previous segment that he was going to the hospital to check on Jimmy Garvin and make sure he was okay? So you're telling me he drove all the way down to the hospital for a quick visit and then turned around and hauled ass back to the studio so he could interview Barry fucking Windham? It was apparently so important that David had to be present to interview Barry Windham. And this was amazing. Typical David Crockett delivery. Ladies and gentlemen, the Horsemen handling their business the same way Kevin Sullivan does. By jumping people from behind. To which Barry just looks at David and goes, "You know me better than that, David. Can't believe you even uttered those words from your mouth." That was Barry being nice, by the way. I'm surprised he didn't twist that little twerp's neck into a pretzel. Have I ever mentioned how amazing David Crockett was? That was how he opened his line of questioning. And he didn't even ask a fucking question. So I don't know what Barry said. I kind of zoned out. Something about how Sting should prepare for the fight of his life because Barry's going to give him a fight like nothing he's ever seen before. It was very plain. Then we pitched to the ring for Ron Simmons versus Joe Cruz. Yep. We can all point out the obvious. You're not the only one. I had totally forgotten about Ron Simmons. When I saw that graphic pop up here, my first thought was, oh yeah, that guy. Yeah, he's still around. Bear in mind, he's about to become the world champion in like 3 to 4 years. My notes here are actually very similar to everything I wrote down about the Barry squash. Lots of moves. He eventually won with the spine buster. There was like literally nothing to say about it. And then we had this very awkward yet hilarious moment after break. They're trying to get Ron to come back out to do a promo, which meant that David and JR had to stall for time while they waited. So David's just standing there with his dick in his hand, trying to establish that Ron Simmons played pro football at one point. You know, he's crossing that threshold into the sport of pro wrestling. Yet at the same time, it is patently clear that David doesn't know shit from apple butter about football. So he basically goes, folks, Ron Simmons used to play football, and now he's here in pro wrestling. He was a great football player, really successful. So Jim Ross, tell us more about Ron Simmons' football career. Way to go, David. Excellent news reporting. What would we do without you, brother? So after JR saved the segment and ran down Ron's credentials, came back to put over the fact that he took some time to hit the gym and improve his ring style, and now he's at the point where he's ready to start gunning after major world championships. And then without explicitly naming what belt he wants to go after, he then did a totally generic say no to drugs promo for all the kids. Talking about how he became successful in football through hard work and determination, not having to use substances to advance his career. It was very scatterbrained. Not that I'm opposed to anti-drug promotion, but like, what did any of this have to do with title aspirations? Not exactly sure. So remember when Ricky Morton came out a few weeks ago and talked about how he wanted to team up with Nikita Koloff and form that unlikely alliance? Well, this week he came out to tag with Dr. Death. And they wrestled The Menace and Jerry Price. I don't even know how to begin to describe this Ricky Morton run in 1988. It is the most bizarre goddamn thing I've ever seen. You want to talk about the epitome of dudes that just exist in the company? Ricky Morton is just a dude. He is so directionless. So he and Williams did a bunch of shit to Price until Williams went over with the Oklahoma Stampede. I don't even think the Menace tagged in one time during the whole match. They just pounded on Price forever until they won. And then we went to another pre-taped interview. This time it was Lex Luger talking about Ric Flair and the World Heavyweight title. Pretty sure they filmed this from the exact same locker room where Flair did his promo. And to my utter astonishment, he did not remove his shirt, which clearly meant Luger meant business. Told Flair that he's only asked for one thing before they signed the contract for their rematch. The stipulation being that Luger wants a fair, impartial referee that can call it right down the middle and handle their own. Actually, his claim, even though Tommy Young was a great official in Baltimore, the problem was that he's 140 pounds soaking wet. He's unable to defend himself when two grown men like Luger and Flair are getting physical. So we need to make sure this referee can hold his own. We need somebody that's both powerful and competent. Good luck with that. And while we don't know that person that Luger is mentioning, he senses that the name will be revealed soon. He's currently negotiating with Jim Crockett to make it happen. By the way, the Starrcade title match between Flair and Luger, it does not have a special guest referee. So I have no idea what Luger was rambling about here. Apparently this was all being done to promote a house show match or some other live event well before December. So we can all try and guess who that special guest referee would have been. And from there, we had Ivan Koloff and the Russian Assassin versus J.C. Wilde and Terry Jones. Story here was that even though Ivan basically did all the work, the Assassin ended up tagging in at the end so he could claim the victory, which is a Paul Jones call. But of course, Ivan was okay with it because, well, clearly Paul Jones knows best. And now we hear that Ivan's been in training mode as he's gearing up for his Russian chain match with Ricky Morton. That is going to be Ivan's proving ground match. His way of assuring that he can still be that killer that Paul Jones brought aboard the Paul Jones Army 2 years ago. And Ivan actually cut a hell of a promo here at the booth. Kind of a semi-babyface promo when you get down to it. He says he's always prided himself on being the best in the sport. Came to the United States to represent the Soviet Union and make his father proud. Which is why Ivan doesn't understand why Paul is putting him through all these series of tests and challenges. I mean, he should have faith that Ivan would make him proud and live up to his word that he promised Paul when he joined the Army. But if he has to do it, he'll make sure he doesn't let Paul down. And you know, you almost kind of felt a little bit of pity on Uncle Ivan here. Yeah, we don't want to stick up for Russia or the Soviet Union. But, I can get behind the idea that Ivan's always prided himself on being the best at what he does. That he's always taken wrestling seriously and wants to honor his family. Who wouldn't? So you can see what they're setting up with him eventually. I'm thinking that chain match with Ricky might not go the way Paul Jones is expecting. So then we had Tully and Arn against Trent Knight and Tommy Angel in the greatest squash of all time. Here's everything that happened. And every second of it was glorious. Arn tried bad-mouthing the announcers while he had his back turned to Trent. Trent whipped Arn with a drop kick in the back of the head. Tried to shoot him off the ropes. At which point, Arn then DDT Trent into oblivion. Killed him dead. 1, 2, 3. And then they immediately walked over to the interview podium for a promo. The saying, they don't get paid by the hour, comes up a lot. Considering the mental state of Arn and Tully by this point in 88, boy, was that ever true. These two were collecting a paycheck and buying the time on the remainder of their contracts, brother. They did not give a fuck. So, as the Horsemen are at the booth ripping into the Midnights, JJ saying that he's done with all the comedy charades and the jokes and the snide remarks. He's wrestled over 30,000 matches in his career, and his opponents have all been more intimidating and more threatening than Jim Cornette. The only battle Corny's been dealing with is a stench of bad breath. And he lost that one too. Double A says, when it comes to men like the Horsemen, Dusty Rhodes, Sting, Luger, they have clout. They have presence. The only thing JC has is a thick bank account. He can ride on the coattails of his mama all he wants. But it's not going to get the Midnights any closer to gaining world championships. The Horsemen never claimed to be fancy or good looking. They're just buttoned-down, serious, ugly pro wrestlers that like to be the best at everything they do. Simple as that. And Double A is spitting facts. He and Tully are definitely mean, ugly pro wrestlers. Nothing fancy about what they do or how they dress. But they make sure you know how incredibly gifted they are. You don't have to like it, but you got to learn to love it. So the remaining 4 minutes of airtime they had, Al Perez won a quick squash with Rick Allen. Then Gary Hart did a pretty good heat promo on Dusty Rhodes, basically saying that what Kevin Sullivan does to Dusty in the dog collar match, it'll be far worse than what we saw happen to Jimmy Garvin earlier. I mean, I could go longer with the verbiage, but there's really no sense in doing so. I just couldn't stand looking at Al Perez any longer. His blank face bores me to sleep. And the Jimmy Garvin angle was obviously the foundation for a lot of the show this week. We did get the confirmation that his ankle is broken after we had seen David Crockett take like 18 round trips back and forth to the hospital. I mean, I'm surprised he didn't come back sweaty and tired. He must have great cardio. But everything else was minor story advancement. Dusty's promo was outstanding this week. My new favorite promo of 1988. Dusty Rhodes calling out the fat lady on the Superstation while he's trying to talk about Gary Hart and Kevin Sullivan. Oh, he probably had the boys howling in the back. I mean, hey, what are you going to do? I mean, if you know somebody's giving you a hard time and trying to hijack your segment, throw it in their face. Be witty. Make sure everybody hears about it. I mean, that's why Dusty's an all-time great. So we're back to musical chairs at the announce booth this week. Last time it was Boyd Pierce and Jim Ross covering the action. And this week it was JR and Bill Watts. And I guarantee you it never crossed Watts' mind. Man, we should really consider doing a 3-man booth. Out of here with that fucking shit. Watts wasn't a goddamn idiot. So I kind of talked about this with a Crockett review. It is Labor Day weekend. I mean, you would have expected the show to be fairly tame in terms of angle or story advancement. Probably weren't going to pull out all the stops, figuring most people are out of town or just not watching local television, period. So bearing that in mind as we analyze the program, the first order of business was to address more of what's going on with the missing link. And Watts had brought up the fact that Skandar Akbar was insistent that Link was mentally stable, that he was gravely offended that we would continue to refer to him as the missing link, given that Akbar already addressed him as Max. So when Watts went to interview Akbar and touch upon the details of that conversation from a couple weeks ago, Akbar kind of reiterated his talking point that his name is Max, and that's all the people need to know. Copyright. So that was kind of focus of the conversation when he had his match with Tim Horner. Commentators went back and forth between calling him the missing link and Mad Max. And Watts had mentioned this like 5 times. He kept going, this missing link reminds me of someone, but gosh darn it, I can't put my finger on it. Tell you who he reminds me of. Guy who couldn't wrestle his way out of a wet paper bag. I mean, the squash was harmless enough. Other than the spot where Link went to try to stun gun Tim on the top rope and nearly decapitated him. Luckily, that only happened in the last 5 seconds of the match. But he won after dropping a series of headbutts on Horner's chest. They'd sort of gotten away from the whole missing link Mad Max deal over the last couple weeks. I think a lot of the story follow-up here was Watts trying to remind everybody of what Akbar said. The fact that Link is perfectly sane and shouldn't be confined to a padded cell at the loony bin. Okay, but 2024 standards, I didn't see much out of the ordinary with his behavior. At least he's cognizant of what gender he's supposed to be. So from there, we came back for the big money advertisement this week. Our first look at the Road Warriors in the Midsouth area. And at the time, they were the International Tag Team Champions in Georgia. I mean, they had quite literally just gotten one foot in the business earlier in the year. So this is well before their popularity took off and they became universal babyfaces around the globe. To this day, it is still weird for me to visualize heel Road Warriors. There are always those names out there that you try to associate with the opposite personality, and it's almost impossible to picture in your head. The Road Warriors have always been like that to me. Just because for like 90% of their career, they've always been babyfaces. And of course, there was the whole turn on Dusty in '88 and that failed heel run that didn't get over during the Jim Herd era. But still, and this was also the segment where I realized, hey, Duggan and Magnum TA are still the reigning Mid-South Tag Team Champions. Remember last week I went on that whole diatribe about me trying to figure out if they just dropped the Duggan Magnum pairing because they hadn't worked together as a team in weeks? Like Magnum was just coming out teaming with Dr. Death. Duggan was off doing his own thing with Akbar. Well, you can forget that conversation ever happened, because they were back together this week. This was almost like I was watching wrestling in a parallel universe. I had totally forgotten that when the Road Warriors came in, they actually turned on Precious Paul for a brief window. And then obviously he came back later on as their full-time manager. But like Watts was talking about that on commentary here, the angle they shot in Memphis. And meanwhile, I'm watching this match as the Hawk and the Animal are getting worked over in amateur takedown spots. God, it's like the whole concept of kayfabe went completely out the window here in 1983. The ass-kicking, no-selling, crowd-favorite Road Warriors that ran roughshod over everybody in 8 seconds flat. God, in 1983, you'd have thought these Hawk and Animal characters were decoys. It was so bizarre. I mean, this whole match was kind of a mess when you really get down to it. In addition to everything I talked about the Road Warriors here, they were also greener than goose shit. Most of everything they did looked choppy. Things eventually break down when Hawk drove Magnum into the ring post on the floor. And then when Duggan's in there trying to make a comeback on the LOD, Duggan ends up getting Animal on the sleeper. And there's a very awkward moment where you see Johnny Martinez look up and pretend he can't see Hawk perched on the top rope. So then Hawk does this big body splash when he comes down and tries to break the fall by landing on his feet. I thought the guy shattered his ankles. God, that looked brutal. But then Martinez calls for the DQ as the babyfaces fight off the heels and send him packing. It was most definitely a Road Warriors TV match in 1983. They eventually found their niche later on when they decided to become 15-second ass-kicking machines. But this version of them in 1983, no bueno. I can't recall offhand if this was their only appearance in Mid-South before they went back to Georgia. I mean, I definitely recall Hawk and Animal working in Mid-South for a brief period. I just can't remember if it was a one-off appearance. Well, I'll tell you what. It was certainly a better squash than the Junkyard Dog versus Boris Zirkov. Granted, this was far shorter than the tag match. But when Zirkov immediately went to try to put the dog in a standing bear hug out of the gate, I was like, is he determined to make this the most boring match of all time? When in the fuck have you ever seen anybody immediately go for a bear hug as their first move? Only geeks that had no basics or fundamentals. So Dog went over with the thumper in about 2 minutes. JR at one point tried to point out the Dog's great physical conditioning. Meanwhile, you can actively see him panting on camera as he's sweating like a motherfucker. Great physical shape he was not. In 1982? Most definitely. We are now in the fall of 1983. And it only gets exponentially worse by 84. Staying on the topic of Dog real briefly here. This next pre-tape was one of the greatest things I've ever seen. Now, Watts had mentioned Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer a couple times throughout the program, mainly putting over the idea that Sawyer wants a shot at the JYD, because, and I quote, everybody wants a shot at the Dog. So we go to film of him in Atlanta, where he is smashing cinder blocks with a biker chain, hanging out with Rottweilers, just being a total unhinged lunatic. But the best part of the video was the commentary. I don't know who was doing this. Like, at first I thought it was Akbar, but it didn't sound groggy or deep enough. It's hilarious, though. It's like if they took David Crockett verbiage and then gave it to some complete random crazy guy. The whole thing is, look at the mad dog. Look at him. He's not pretty. My favorite line in the whole thing, it's a total throwaway line, but when you really think about it contextually, it's hysterical. The mad dog backs away from nobody, especially his own kind. It's just total wackiness. And like the whole point of the video is to establish that there can only be one dog in the Mid-South area. I mean, it's literally the exact same thing they were doing with Hacksaw Butch Reed and Jim Duggan when Reed first came into the territory, fighting over the identity of who can be rightfully called Hacksaw. I mean, the whole clip was straight out of Memphis, or even Dallas. Here's a guy with a wacky gimmick swimming in dirty water, playing with rabid dogs, chopping wood with a biker chain, just acting all crazy. Meanwhile, there's all the dubbed over commentary making sure to put over how crazy the guy is. I hate using the word campy because it makes it sound like I'm downplaying it. I'm really not. But I watched this whole thing like 3 times in a row. I laugh my ass off every time. I think Buzz Sawyer might be my new favorite wrestler of the month. Next time we see him in a pre-tape, I want to see him swimming with alligators. So that took us to Mad Dog's match with Johnny Rich. Basically just a tune-up match for Sawyer as JR and Watts are kind of selling the eventual face-off between him and JYD. He did sell a lot more for Rich than I thought he would. I mean, I just figured he'd go in there and barrel over the guy in a minute. But he actually let Johnny Rich get in some offense. And he eventually gave Johnny a beautiful power slam off the ropes for the 3 count. It was awesome, too, because, Johnny Rich was trying to make the comeback. He comes flying off the ropes with all his momentum. Mad Dog just scooped him off the ground, turned him over like he was nothing. Got a shit ton of height on it, too. He'd even popped Bill Watts. He was very impressed. But yeah, that appears to be JYD's next program here. He will soon be locking horns with Buzz Sawyer. Switching gears, though, took a minute to revisit the footage of last week's tag match with DiBiase and Bundy against Magnum and Dr. Death. And if you recall, that was the match where Duggan had intercepted DiBiase's gimmick that he tried to pitch to Akbar on the floor, and it wound up costing DiBiase the match because Duggan clocked him in the head with it and laid him out cold. So now DiBiase is laying it all on the table. That incident was the boiling point. And you might remember, too, a while back, I had alluded to the idea of the loser leaves town stipulation between Duggan and DiBiase. Well, DiBiase laid the groundwork this week. He wants Hacksaw on television next week. No disqualification. If DiBiase can't beat Duggan, he'll pack his bags and leave the Mid-South area. And I probably already spoiled the outcome, if it wasn't already predictable to begin with. I'll make sure I go more in depth with the conversation next time. But they've set up the big showdown. And after everything we've seen with the split of the Rat Pack, Duggan going full babyface, the altercations with DiBiase on and off for the last couple months, it's finally time to settle the score. And you got to figure Akbar's going to get involved, right? We all know that he and DiBiase are closely linked. And you know that no DQ stipulation is simmering in the back of his head. So that brought us to King Kong Bundy and Art Cruz. Really not a whole lot to say about it, actually. Quick TV win for Bundy. Went over with the Avalanche Splash. Story-wise, they're still pushing the issue with him and Dr. Death. You know, the fact that Bundy's still butthurt over Steve getting that visual pin on him a few weeks ago. Still hasn't let it go. So you have to figure those two will eventually face off. And then moving on with Crusher Darso and George Weingroff. Dude, I still can't get over Darso and these fucking Daisy Dukes. How in the world he sported that look for more than 2 appearances? It's wild. Thank God in heaven he had some size to him. Elsewise, this would be a whole different conversation. Again, though, really not much to say about it. You know, Weingroff got overpowered, muscled around for a little bit. Darso won with a Canadian backbreaker. Very short. I know we're still a ways out from the gimmickry package and, you know, them making Darso the Russian adversary. God, every time I see Barry Darso, man, in these jean shorts, him just going out there and being a generic heel, really makes me crave seeing the Russian sickle that much more. Then we had Rip Rogers versus another debuting face in the Mid-South area. Although he would go on to become a much bigger name in the WWF in a few years. No, I think we've actually covered Rick Rude when he was working underneath matches in Dallas. But this is back when he spelled his name Rick R-O-O-D. Rick Rude. He was, well, he was definitely Rick Rude. Even back in 1983, the guy was in phenomenal shape. He was not quite as tanned and fleshed out as he'd become in a few years. But he still had that ass-kicking mustache. He was also a natural talent. You know, even Watts pointed out that he knew nothing about Rude's background. By the end of this segment, he was sold on Rude's ability. This is a great showcase for him. And yeah, like mostly everything he did was pretty basic. But even JR accurately pointed out, he did not make any visible errors. It was very steady back and forth, but Rude was largely in the driver's seat. You know, made a fun comeback on Rogers at the end, went over with a swinging neck breaker. I mean, the guy was a naturally gifted worker from day one. You know, we always talk about the guys that came into the business and had to spend years working on their fine-tuning. Nah, Rick Rude was one of those guys that just got it. I mean, he was like a Kern Heddig where he rarely ever fucked anything up. He was always in the right place. I think the only thing Rude really needed by this point was a gimmick that suited his personality. And then we saw what he became in a couple years on a bigger stage. And then we heard him talk. Boy, howdy, that guy could cut a promo. You often forget about those kinds of things. So yeah, there was definitely a good lot of stuff to talk about. Is that proper grammar? A good lot of stuff. I don't know, dude. I'm tired. Again, though, it's a holiday episode. You always have to take that into account. Definitely looking forward to Duggan and DiBiase next week. But, yeah, pretty unremarkable episode by and large. Love the video package with Buzz Sawyer and JYD, setting up that feud. A couple fun moments with a few new names showing up. The Road Warrior squash was a lot of fun. But, yeah, it's kind of it. Very bland, tame episode. Certainly could have been a lot more dull than it was. No, actually, the doll program was over here in Dallas, Texas. And I'm not just saying that because they had a ladies' match booked this week. Actually, I think the ladies' bout was probably the only highlight. At least that was fresh. Man, what do you say about world class at this point, dude? I mean, I know it seems like I'm just regurgitating the same talking points over and over again. They're certainly doing stuff. Not all of it's good. You know, I think after last week, the whole Mike von Erich health scare, it had a lot of people on edge. You know, as a business promoter, you want to try to roll with the punches and do your best to produce a good wrestling show. You know, but so many people are swept up in, oh, what's going on with Mike? How's he doing? Is he recovering okay? What's his estimated time to return to the ring? And it's hard to process a lot of that. As it pertains to the girls' match, Linda Dallas and Misty Blue. Linda sporting her kung fu bandana for the occasion. It's definitely been a hot minute since we recapped a girls' match on World Class. When they announced Misty Blue as the world's women's champion, my first thought was, sure, we'll go with that theory. It was probably a more memorable title reign than whatever they were doing with Alundra Blaze in the WWF circa 1995. I always just get a kick out of watching girls banter at each other like acrimonious old women. Like 90% of this match was Linda Dallas screaming at David Manning the whole time, complaining that Misty was cheating and being unfair. Meanwhile, Linda was the one doing all the hair pulling and the eye gouging. Like, it's one thing when guys do this kind of stuff. When the girls do it, I just laugh. Once you become red-pilled like me, you see girls arguing back and forth. There is an element of comedy to that, whether or not it's a work. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, think about that old cliche that everybody jokes about. All women secretly hate each other. You'll figure it out. The wrestling here was pretty abysmal. There was a lot of what I can merely best describe as rolling and fumbling around. I don't really know if I would say that's a good thing based on what I saw transpiring in the wrestling ring. But the ladies tried. I've reviewed a handful of Misty Blue matches before. I mean, our latest reviews would have been her very short-lived run in Crockett Promotions in '87. You know, she was around for like 2 months and then completely vanished. There was probably a reason for that. If anything, my notes at the end here summarize everything you need to know about the match. Quote, Misty hit something pertaining to a body press. Oh, wait, that's the finish. Unquote. She may have attempted a crossbody. She forgot about the cross part. It's pretty much all I got out of it. And keep in mind what I said earlier. This was a highlight of the program. A mediocre girls match. Mediocre is still probably giving it too much credit. Then we came back to see some Iceman footage. We all know about the ongoing beef with him and Gary Hart over the last couple months. So after we came back and reviewed a lot of the footage of the Iceman's matches with Gary Hart's crew, we see him in the bowels of some undisclosed location. And Iceman's throwing soup bones with a punching bag, letting us all know that he's coming for Gary Hart and his team because it's got to be that way sometimes. He said that Gary's in for some hard times, brother. And we all know that when the Iceman comes on this program to preach, he means business. So watch out, Gary. King Parsons cometh. And that kind of segued into the Iceman's match with Jack Victory here. The Iceman sporting his poop brown diarrhea splotch tights this week. Okay, side tangent here. I need to know from the experts, of all trunk colors to pick, brown? Is there any more unappealing shade you could go with? I'm sure someone will think of something. Piss yellow? I didn't write a whole lot down about this match either. Very basic ring work. The Iceman controlled the action early on. You know, Jack Victory cut him off and worked him over for a little bit. I wrote down, Iceman is in a stationary headlock for 45 minutes. Then the Iceman did some shucking and jiving during his comeback, came off the ropes and hit the hip attack for the 3 count. It was probably the most unmemorable King Parsons match I've ever recapped here on the channel. Shit-stained tights notwithstanding. But on to the bigger items of business. Health update on Mike's status. It's kind of what everybody wanted to hear following last week's news. And you know, regardless of the in-ring product, this was one of those critical moments in time where you could argue the world of kayfabe really didn't matter. I think people just kind of wanted to know how Mike was doing. So they held a press conference with the same physician that reported on Mike's condition the other week. Kind of explained the situation and what led to Mike's illness following the shoulder surgery. Potentially botched shoulder surgery, although they did not want to speculate on that. But they were very optimistic about his recovery. Both the doctors and the family. You know, Fritz got the last word, ensuring us that Mike would make a full speed recovery and then come back better than ever before. You know, it's one of those things where, I mean, you have to ensure the good news to all the people watching, because the Von Erichs are such an important part to the community. You know, the mere fact that he did survive a terminal illness, I mean, that was a miracle in and of itself. I mean, they basically imply that he's no longer critically ill, which is layman's terms for he's probably not going to make it. But he did. And, you know, it's a good message. Kerry and Kevin got to talk a little bit. You know, like I said, the doctors confirmed that he was stable. It's going to take time for him to be healthy enough to come back and wrestle, but that was the talking point. He'll be back. And with that, TV main event is Gino Hernandez and Chris Adams against Kerry Von Erich and Brian Adias. I'm shaking my head right now. Never mind. I'll save the tangent for the end. I was getting a little antsy there. You know, the one thing I will never take away from Gino and Chris, they are a well-oiled machine. Those guys know exactly how to time everything they do. You want to talk about, like, critically underrated tag teams of all time? Chris and Gino, dude. Everything they do is always on point. The timing of their spots, always being in the right place. It's amazing people don't talk about them enough. And, like, all of their heel antics get over in the Sportatorium because, well, they're fucking over the baby faces temporarily. And they kind of work the dual heat strategy where Brian got to run wild for a bit. But then he got cut off so Kerry could make the valiant save at the end. In terms of spots prior to the finish, I mean, nothing really stood out beyond the format of what I just mentioned. But I'm telling you, man, these goddamn scissors are going to be the death of me. Every time I see these guys break out the scissors and try to cut somebody's hair, I immediately want to cover up my face. The joke is that I'm just waiting for somebody to get punctured in the neck or stabbed in the eye. That almost legitimately happened to Gino here. Kerry's fighting with the heels over possession of the scissors, and right as Gino's arms are trapped in the ropes, Kerry starts making his way over with these jagged fucking scissors. At which point, Chris Adams decks Kerry in the back of the head. The scissors go flying over Gino's head. There's no way for him to protect himself. I was like, am I watching WCW? Do we just not care about the safety and health of our workers? I continue to be floored every time I see them shoot angles with these guys. Like, they even replay it in slow motion. You can see the scissors go flying out of Kerry's hands and nearly pierce Gino in the fucking face. I wanted to turn the show off right there and be like, I'm done. I'm phoning it in with the world-class reviews. Just for that singular moment. And God, like, you think about the irony of the timing. In the very previous segment, they are recapping a legitimate hell scare involving Mike on the brink of death. Meanwhile, here's fucking Gino and Chris wrestling with Kerry over giant scissors. I just can't. This is the worst gimmick in world class, simply because of that. The Brutus Beefcake scissors. Actually, it's worse, because these aren't even gimmicked. God in heaven, dude. In any case, that was world class. The lesson is don't tempt fate with sharp projectiles. You know, again, it's good to hear about Mike's recovery. Time window is still up in the air about when he's going to be back, but, you know, it is good news to give the insurance that he will be back. But again, man, it's just like 1985 in general. It's such a rough year for this company. The wave of the momentum has completely died off following the end of the Freebirds Von Erich program. And to their credit, they've tried to rekindle some of that by bringing in Gino and the Chris Adams heel turn, aligning those two, making them the top heels. But they're not on the same level as the Freebirds. And it's not a knock on Gino or Chris's talents, but the Freebirds just had a natural appeal that they were never going to duplicate. The personalities were way different. And, like, obviously you had the stuff with Gary Hart's team as well, and a lot of that took a back seat this week, which is fine. I mean, they were pretty central to last week's show. But again, dude, I always come back to that talking point about the booking. And we're just at the point with world class where, I don't know. If it's not directly tied to Gary Hart or the Von Erichs, it's just stuff that exists on the program. And you hate to see it fall to that point, but that's the reality. Again, the loss of the Freebirds really put a dent in things. They've lost a lot of star power. I mean, they got a little bit of a spark back with Bruiser Brody's return. But even he didn't make a single appearance this show. I mean, they got some names. They got some bodies. But outside that core group of guys, it's a whole lot of sizzle without the steak. Where have I heard that phrase before? Wow. that'll wrap up the Friday show here. Again, I'm recording this really early because I don't know when I'm going to have a chance to upload this tomorrow. I'm hoping I can at least get the editing done late tonight. That way it'll just be easier when I upload it tomorrow morning. Maybe not even in the morning. It might even be in the evening at this rate. I don't know. But thanks everybody for stopping by and checking out the show. Again, just to recap, this coming Monday is going to be the Takeover special and then Retro Raw. We've had a couple weeks break because of the preemption, but we are now back to business as usual there. So, appreciate everybody coming back to check it out and talk to you soon. Take care now. Peace out.